Hey, everybody, good evening. Welcome to a celebration of Nantucket Sound, or ACONS, our free educational webinar series. See a number of lots of new names, so I just want to spend a couple of minutes telling you who we are, what this series is about. My name is Peter Aramo. I am the Communications Director at the Alliance. We are a nonprofit environmental organization based in Hyannis on Cape Cod. Our mission is the permanent protection and preservation of Nantucket Sound, the body of water that lies between Cape Cod and the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. Now, this is especially important. I'm just going to share one one slide here. Here we go. It's important because Nantucket Sound, as you can see, it's even though it's one ecosystem, it's split between federal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction. You have federal waters right in the center, right here. Of the Sound, surrounded by state waters that run about 3 miles from the coastline of Cape Cod and the islands. And the state waters are part of the Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuary System, and they are protected, but the federal waters, those remain open to future development. Now, you may be aware that early last year, the current administration issued a temporary withdrawal of areas from offshore wind leasing. Now, while this directive includes the federal waters of Nantucket Sound, it is only a temporary measure and can easily be reversed by the current or future administrations. So our mission to protect Nantucket Sound permanently and across changing political landscapes remains as important as ever. Now, the Alliance embarked on significant community outreach to determine what's the best type of permanent protection for this special body of water, and have for the last several years been pursuing a National Historic Landmark designation for all of Nantucket Sound. The National Historic Landmark designation is, in fact, the highest level of historic protection possible. So this designation would recognize Nantucket Sound as a sacred tribal site, protect traditional uses like fishing and recreation, and preserve this body of water in perpetuity. Throughout this process, we have built a very large and diverse coalition of support with nearly 100 stakeholder groups on board. We have municipalities all along the shores of the Cape and Islands. We have historic preservation groups, chambers of commerce, tribal entities, environmental organizations, and many others that represent hundreds of thousands of individuals. In order to build support for the need to permanently protect Nantucket Sound, we've been spreading awareness as to what makes the Sound so special. And we've been hosting this webinar series since September 2020. We had our 5-year anniversary last September, which we call ACONS, or a celebration of Nantucket Sound. And it's really to celebrate the historic, economic, cultural, and environmental significance of the Sound. So this evening, I'm happy to welcome Carolyn Tepolt of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And Carolyn will discuss the invasive green crab species in our waters and beyond. And I'm just going to say a little bit about Carolyn. Hi, Carolyn. She's a marine biologist. She was born and raised in southern New Hampshire. She joined the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution's biology department in 2017 after postdoctoral research in biodiversity genomics at the Smithsonian Institution. In 2014, she received a PhD from Stanford, where she studied at the Hopkins Marine Station on Monterey Bay. Her research program is focused on understanding how marine species adapt to changing environments on timescales of decades to centuries. She works extensively with marine invasive species and integrates approaches from genomics, ecology, and physiology. Now, throughout her presentation, if you think of something, put a question in the Q&A. I'm going to hop off and I'm going to come back on after Carolyn finishes her presentation and we'll take your questions. So feel free to write them in the Q&A. Hi, Carolyn. How are you? And thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Sorry, I was playing with my light. I apologize for all the glare off my
Oh,
glasses.
no, you look great. You look great. Excellent. I'm excited. And just for people out there, I've been trying to get someone to speak on the green crab species for this webinar. So I'm super excited for this. And again, thank you so much. I'm going to hop off and the screen will be all of yours. And hope everybody enjoys.
Awesome. Thank you so
Thanks,
much. All
Ken.
right, I am gonna share my screen. It'll take me just a sec to get it set up correctly. So if you bear with me for just a moment. I somehow have not figured out yet how to get the presenter view without having to go through that rigmarole, but hopefully you can all see the full page slides. If not, Peter, please speak up and let me know.
Looks perfect.
All right, fabulous. Yeah. As Peter said, I'm Carolyn Tepolt. I'm a biologist at WHOI, and I've been working on green crabs for, I think I realized it's about 20 years now. So it's been quite a while. And I think they're really fascinating animals. So I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about some of my work. And I'm going to start by talking more broadly about invasive species and marine invasive species and some of the reasons why we care about them before getting more specifically into green crabs. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing on the West Coast, which is where a lot of my green crab work has been based for reasons that I'll mention a little bit later, and how that kind of connects back to green crabs here in our neck of the woods. So to start really broad, what makes a species invasive? This is something there's actually not a really like set definition, but the way that I think about it, which is pretty standard, is that it kind of involves three major components. One is that it has to be a species that gets moved from its native range, from the place it evolved over millennia, to a new geographic area. It's important that we have to be the ones that moved it. So, species move themselves around all the time, including in the ocean. There's a lot of really interesting examples of species being spread by rafting, for example, in seaweed and other things. Or you can think about palm trees spreading with coconuts in the Pacific. And so they're doing that on their own, so not invasive. And then the kind of squishiest part of the definition, but I want the one that I think is the most important, is that we really only call stuff invasive if it becomes a problem for us, right? We move a lot of things around that we don't think of as invasive. We wouldn't really consider like cows or wheat or potatoes to be invasive, but those are things that we've moved around extensively, but we're pretty happy with them. And so why do we care? Well, this is a little bit of a rogues gallery of some of the most prominent invasive species around the world. There was a study done about 20 years ago now, which is almost certainly out of date, and you can pick some nits with some of the methods, but I think it's a reasonable first line estimate that looked at invasive species in the US and estimated that there were about 50,000 invasive species in the US, that they cost about $120 billion annually. This is not just for kind of mitigation, but also for dealing with the consequences of invasive species. If you think of things like zebra mussels, clogging pipes in the Great Lakes, that can get really expensive really fast. And on an ecological level, invasive species have been listed as a primary threat to over 40% of endangered species. So they have really important economic and ecological impact. And one of the big things that I'm really interested in is this question of how invaders move around and how they change and differentiate in new environments. And they kind of move around all the ways that we do, essentially. Invasive species are really flexible and really great at kind of exploiting human transportation. I like this example because these are all these lovely little creatures that are tooling around in their trucks and cars and taxis, are all very familiar to us, and they are, oh, I'm sorry, that looks a little weird on the screen, but they are almost all invasive species in one place, one way or another, and we've moved them around. But I think about marine invasive species. Marine invasive species are a little bit less likely to get transported in a taxi or a fire truck or like a croc mobile. And they're a lot more likely to get moved around on boats. I also like the scary example here too, because lots of little creatures moved around in these boats are mice and rats, which are major invasive species that have been moving around from place to place on boats with people basically as long as people have been taking boats to places. But we have some more modern ways of getting around. And some invasive species, many invertebrates species, are kind of interesting because they don't necessarily move a lot as adults. Crabs can move, but they're not going hundreds of miles. And things like mussels and barnacles, we really don't think of as having much kind of get up and go at all. But when they're young, they have a real wandering stage. So these are essentially baby pictures of all the things that I showed you before. When they're born, they have this larval phase and they're part of the zooplankton. So they're moving around in ocean currents and they're spending days, weeks, and sometimes even months there. And it gives them a really amazing ability to move around, not only with us, but also once they get to a new area, they can move with currents and they can really effectively spread in new areas, as I'm going to show you with green crabs. Green crabs are great at this. And so one of the ways that they can move around are on cargo ships. So as we have gotten better and better at moving stuff around the globe, pretty fast and pretty efficiently. We do a lot of that moving in huge cargo ships. And these cargo ships obviously have a lot of surface area for fouling species to grow on. So they can grow on the hull. If you have a boat or a dock or anything that you leave in the water over the summer, you're probably really familiar with the fact that this rich community of goo will grow on it over the course of the season. And all of that grows on these huge vessels that then potentially get moved around from place to place. As a little bit of a sidebar, there are some rules about hull scraping. But actually, even without the rules, a lot of places do try to do some hull cleanup for these big vessels. And that's because if you have a ton of stuff growing on your hull, it increases drag and you use more gas. So there's kind of actually an economic incentive to keep your hull at least somewhat clean if you're in the shipping industry. But in addition to growing on the vessels, a lot of these cargo ships also have ballast water. So in order to kind of maintain the same depth in the water and good stability, even with a light cargo or not a lot of cargo, they have these big tanks that you can pump full of water in one port. And then if you pick up a heavy cargo, you can dump that water out again. And when you do that, you are picking up all of the little things that are living in the water. These barnacles, clams, crabs, tons of other species. This is another super effective way of moving marine invasive species around from place to place. But it's actually not just ships, just to give you another example, that move marine invasive species around. As I said, a lot of things can move almost all the ways that we move. And like we probably wouldn't take a ship to go, from here to Europe. We'd probably take a plane. Some invasive species can potentially do that as well. So we're really good at shipping things like live seaweed, like your nice live seafood, rather, your nice Maine lobsters, or if you're a fisherman, bait worms and bloodworms get caught often up in Maine and shipped around the country really fast, packed in seaweed packing material much of the time to keep them fresh and happy and healthy. And that seaweed is full of lots of little critters. And so that's another way that marine species, you may not really think about like a crab or a snail or something going somewhere by air, but it's actually, it is another way to get from A to B. This is just a little historical sidebar, and I promise we'll be done talking about terrestrial species after this, but it really doesn't take a lot of individuals to get to a new place to have a huge impact. I like to mention this just because it's one of my favorite invasion stories. It's also sort of one of the weirder vectors of invasions, which is to think about the story of the European starling here in the US. So this gentleman, Eugene Schieffelin, lived in New York in the late 1800s, and he thought that it would be pretty cool if Central Park had all of the bird species mentioned in the works of Shakespeare. Starlings are mentioned once in Henry IV, being taught to speak nothing but Mortimer. And so Schieffelin decided that was a pretty good place to start. Introduced 60 birds to Central Park in 1890, 40 in 1891, and from that beginning, we have hundreds of millions of starlings in the US. I'm guessing that a lot of you probably have the same thing I do, which is if you have a bird feeder, you probably see them all the time about this time of year. So it's just kind of an example of, I guess, one of the weirder ways that things have been introduced, but also that again, it really doesn't necessarily take a lot of individuals to potentially have a really successful population if the conditions are right. But okay, we're done talking about terrestrial stuff. We're going to talk about marine. We're going to talk about green crabs. So the European green crab, Carcinus manus, crustacean non grata. I think about it because everybody kind of hates it except for in the native range. Shown here doing one of the things we dislike it for doing, which is eating clams. I know the guy who took this photo and he swears he didn't pose it. Um, and as I mentioned before, green crabs are one of those marine species that has this larval phase. So these are some baby photos. The one on the left with the big spine on the head, that's what a green crab looks like when it's first hatched. And one female green crab can hatch up to 185,000 larvae. So that's a pretty effective way of spreading as well, although most of those larvae are not going to survive. It stays in the water column for a number of weeks, molts a few times, looks pretty much the same, and then right before it's ready to settle down as a tiny crab, molts into this megalopal stage, which you see on the right, which kind of looks like a weird pop-eyed alien crab thing. This is still in the water column, moving around, but its next molt, it will settle down to live on the bottom, and it'll just be a really tiny crab. Um, just as a kind of a side note, in our area, what I've noticed is that they tend to all settle out of the water column kind of at one time. So around kind of late July to mid-August, if you go to a sandy or like a pebbly beach and you look really, really closely, you will probably see tons of little tiny crabs running around. And not all of them, but many of them will probably be green crabs. They kind of all seem to decide to settle down to be tiny crabs all about the same time at the end of the summer. And green crabs, as you're probably well aware, are considered a pretty harmful invasive species. They're on this list of the world's 100 worst invasive alien species, and they're actually one of only a few marine species that made the list. Marine invasions tend to be a little bit more overlooked, even though they can still be incredibly high impact. I kind of like this wanted poster. And I also want to point out if you are at all unsure if you find a crab and you're not sure if it's a green crab, this points out one of the really important features of a green crab is these 5 spines. So there'll be 5 really clear spines on either side of the eyes. And if you see those 5 spines, especially in a crab that has like a little bit of a kind of a diamond shape, kind of narrows in at the back, that is almost certainly a green crab. Nothing else has those 5 spines in our area. They're not necessarily green, so the spines are a better indicator. This is just my partner's mom cut this out of the newspaper in Portland for me back when people got actual newspapers. And it's article about green crabs up in the Gulf of Maine with the kind of hyperbolic subheading, "Green crabs destroy clams. Are lobsters next?" Uh, and they are potentially an issue to some extent to the lobster fishery as well, as I'll mention in a minute. And that's because, among other things that green crabs do that we find pretty antisocial are they destroy eelgrass beds. So these are important nursery habitats for scallops and for lots of other commercially and ecologically important species. The green crabs don't eat the eelgrass, but they kind of dig and then they like clip it and break it up. And essentially, in that way, they kind of uh, turn these really nice little forests of eelgrass more into muddy areas, and this can be a big issue for a lot of other species. They can also just directly eat shellfish. So they've been implicated in crashing the softshell clam fishery in the Gulf of Maine in the 50s. And there have been a number of studies showing that essentially, this is kind of an unusual photo because it's a pretty big clam. Usually they'll go after the seed clam, the little guys, and they're really effective at finding those, pulling them out, and crunching them. And then finally, there are other interactions that they have with native species. So Green crab isn't really much competition for an adult lobster, but things like lobsters, Dungeness crabs, and other commercially important species, when they're younger, often compete for food and space and resources with green crabs. So there are kind of a lot of different reasons that green crabs are considered a pretty major issue. But they've been incredibly successful. So their native range, as you might guess from the name, European green crab, is Europe and a little bit of North Africa. But they've successfully invaded every other continent except Antarctica. And there's some work suggesting that they are quite cold tolerant and they may be coming for Antarctica as well at some point. And I'm really interested in green crabs, in part because while they're a temperate species, right, you don't find them in the poles, you don't find them in the tropics. They span a really wide range of environments, and particularly temperature environments. Um, it's pretty different in Norway, for example, than in southern Portugal. And I'm really interested in that interaction of green crabs and temperature and how that's shaped, where they can spread, and how they adapt to new environments. But we're going to focus first on green crabs here in New England. Um, and I went into the archives a little bit for this. The very first record of green crabs anywhere outside of their native range is from 1817. Thomas Say here, who has a pretty aggressive kind of facial hair situation going on. He reported to the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia an account of the crustacea of the United States. And he described it as Cancer granulatus. He thought this was a new species that he was seeing. But if you see in the description, he says there's 5 lateral teeth. And so that's kind of that diagnostic green crab feature. And I want to point out, I think I had told Peter beforehand that the first record was from somewhere around Long Island Sound. That seems to be what people say, but this is 100% pretty much of the description of where green crabs are from Say. And he doesn't say anything at all. 200 years ago was a really different time in biology, and we really didn't realize at that point how important it might be to know where you were finding animals, both geographically and in terms of the environment they were living in. But this is our first record of green crabs, so over 200 years ago. They turn up again in this report on the invertebrata of Massachusetts by Gould here. Now we're a little bit more specific. He's also calling it Carcinus manus. He's giving it the right name. 5 lateral teeth again. And here he's gotten a little more clear on where he's looking. The crab he examined was sent by Dr. Yale from Martha's Vineyard. And now he says there is no doubt that our crab is identical with the European species. So he's now kind of identified it as what it is in the 1840s, and we know that it's right in this kind of south of Cape Cod, Nantucket Sound area. Just a note, I love these old papers. Gould has a comment on crabs in general. They are naturally repulsive in their appearance. Many of them are beautifully ornamented with colors. So I'm glad he gave them a little bit of credit. I don't really agree with him on the repulsivity. I think that they can be pretty charming creatures, but I also could never get away with writing that anything I studied was naturally repulsive in its appearance in a contemporary scientific paper. So I really love the color that you get sometimes with these older reports. Moving forward, and I don't have too many more of these, don't worry. In the 1870s, we have a report on the invertebrate animals, or report upon the invertebrate animals of Vineyard Sound and adjacent waters by Addison Verrill and his student Sidney Smith. And now they're listing this as Carcinus granulatus. So now they're going back to being a little bit unclear as to whether or not it really is the same as the European species, but they're reporting it as from south of Cape Cod all the way down to New Jersey. And they were a little confused about the species in part because they would have expected it to be found further north if it was a European species, not thinking about it as an introduced species, but as being Carcinus manus, and this being an extension of its native range. And just as a small side note, the actual facts of the scanned-in copy of the book that I got was originally from the Harvard Library, and you can see Alexander Agassiz' signature from right inside the front cover, which I thought was really cool. And then just finally, to kind of round out our little historical sketch of the green crab, Rachel Carson talked about them in The Edge of the Sea. And she talked a little bit more broadly about this phenomenon of Cape Cod not being the absolute barrier it once had for warm water species attempting to round it from the south. So historically, there are a lot of species whose northern range edges end at Cape Cod, south of Cape Cod. Essentially, it's a little bit colder and a little bit harsher up in the Gulf of Maine. And so Cape Cod is a major biogeographic barrier, but we're seeing a lot of things moving north. And Rachel Carson was observing this even in the 50s. And she mentioned as an example of this northward movement, the green crab, once unknown north of the Cape, now familiar to every clam fisherman in Maine because of its habit of preying on the young stages of the clam. And the map I put in here is from a paper by Joe Roman, just kind of showing you the spread of green crabs on the East Coast over the years. And I should say that this map is now pretty out of date. It's 20 years old. Green crabs are now pretty far up into Quebec and pretty extensively around Newfoundland. They have made it into some really, really cold waters recently. And I like this observation of Rachel Carson's because it highlights something that folks on the East Coast have been noticing for quite a while, which is that essentially when the winters are warmer, when waters are warmer, but particularly winter temperatures, you tend to get more crabs. Essentially, cold winters tend to knock the green crabs down a little bit more. Warmer winters don't do that. And they also notice that when you get those warmer winters and you get more crabs, you tend to get fewer soft shell clams. So this is from a report from 1968, kind of showing some of those interconnections. And a lot of my work, as I said, is focused on this idea of how green crabs change in new environments. So how do they adapt to novel conditions, and how do they basically spread and thrive across such a broad range of environments? And I do this using genetic data pretty extensively, other tools as well, but we do a lot with genetics. Um, and just to illustrate that a little bit, I find this really interesting because this kind of genetic variation, really small scale differences between individuals and populations, so not long-term differences between species and genera, but the really small scale stuff, tells us a lot about the recent history and the potential near future of species and populations. So you can think about it a lot like Ancestry.com for crabs, essentially. And some of the things that these data can tell us are things like for invasive species, where did new populations come from, which can be really important to understanding how they got there and potentially controlling future introductions. They can tell us a lot about dispersal, so how animals are moving around and how populations are connected from site to site. So this is important from a management point of view, especially with a species like the green crab, which has larvae that kind of go all over the place potentially. Because if you're really trying to manage green crabs in your bay here, but if your bay here and this bay up the coast are basically exchanging larvae all the time, right? They're going right back and forth with no real barriers. Then you can do all the trapping you want in your bay, and you're going to constantly get new crabs and new larvae from that other bay. And so really you want to coordinate and you want to do that management or that trapping across those multiple areas that are connected by dispersal. And finally, thing I really, really am interested in is you can tell you something about adaptation. So about how populations are shaped by their environments and what this might mean in terms of how they spread and what new environments species can make it to. So to summarize a little bit of the work that genetics has told us actually quite a while ago now, we can say a little bit more about green crabs and green crabs and their history in North America using genetic tools. So we knew 1817, first record here in southern New England. But we know from genetic data that the green crabs that got here first came from somewhere in South Central Europe. Um, we also know that green crabs, as they spread north, um, they kind of paused for a while in southern Nova Scotia. And then in the 80s, they went much further north. And there was a lot of speculation as to why that was, but some work by Joe Roman showed that that's because there was a second introduction of green crabs to the north from a northern European source. And so that was kind of our first indication that there might be differences in within the species in terms of how animals deal with temperature. And that maybe getting this second infusion of like new blood from Northern Europe might have brought in some cold tolerant genetic variation and allowed green crabs to make that big expansion north. And this is something that genetically, or sorry, without genetics, we would never have known that there was this second introduction to the East Coast and that that was really part of the impetus for that spread to the north. And finally, the west coast of North America. It's a much more recent introduction, and this is the one where I've actually spent a lot of my time researching. And we know, again, from genetics that this population didn't come from Europe, it didn't come from Australia or Japan, where there are established populations. It came from basically here. It came from the East Coast. Um, and that was around 1989, 1990 to San Francisco Bay. And because based on the dates and where things came from, we can kind of start to speculate on how green crabs got around. And the answer is kind of all sorts of different ways. We think that first introduction was probably in solid ballast because we didn't ballast with water back in the 1800s. You just kind of potentially pick some rocks up off the shore, and whatever those rocks were coated in, and whatever was living in the stuff that was coating the rocks, you dump them in your hull, and then you dump them off on the beach somewhere else. So we're pretty sure that that's actually how green crabs first got to our neck of the woods. Um, by 1983, when green crabs got to Nova Scotia that second time, it was almost certainly ballast water. So larvae, the first time around was probably small crabs just hiding in the rocks and the weed. Second time around, probably larvae that got sucked up somewhere in Northern Europe in a cargo ship and moved over to a major port in Nova Scotia. And then on the West Coast, we think they came by air. We think there was probably seaweed packing material, maybe with live lobsters. You can maybe think about some seafood place in Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, getting a shipment in, taking out the lobster, and then just dumping the seaweed out into the bay with anything that was in it. And we think that that may have been what happened there. And I'm going to tell you a little bit now about the invasion on the West Coast. I know that's not where we're based, but because the West Coast was invaded much more recently and it spread super rapidly, we actually have really good records on the West Coast in ways that we don't here on the East Coast. And green crabs have been a major management concern ever since they came in. So there's just been a lot more focus and resources on the spread of green crabs on the West Coast because that's sort of been happening in a much more contemporary fashion. So hopefully this will animate. Oh, yes, it will. So you can watch green crabs move their way up the coast. And you can see how rapid this spread is from that 1989 start. Green crabs have made it all the way up to Southeast Alaska. I think, unfortunately, in the time since this animation was made, which was in July, and now I think we need to move the upper limit up a little bit more. They are spreading pretty rapidly in Southeast Alaska. And it's just been a really massive explosion over 2,500 kilometers in under 35 years after introduction. And remember, I mentioned warming and warm winters on the East Coast. We have a lot of really good data on the West Coast that says that when you have a warming event, you get a lot more crabs. So these are catch data from a colleague of mine. These are taken from some sites in Oregon and Washington. Starting 1998, the very first year green crabs were ever found in those states. And you can see that there are more crabs in these warm years, particularly these El Nino years, up until recently when there are lots of marine heat waves and green crabs have just exploded. There's been a huge spread of green crabs in a lot of places since about 2017 on the West Coast. And it seems really strongly linked to warmer waters. So some of my work has been to look for evidence of differentiation in green crabs on the West Coast. They've spread really fast. It's a really recent introduction. So we want to know if genetics can tell us anything about how connected populations are or if they're adapting to temperature. And I do this using single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, are probably what I'll call them. And all this means is if you have a bunch of different crabs, you have a place in the genome that differs by a single base pair. So an A, T, C, or G, it's kind of the smallest possible unit of genetic differentiation. And each one of these doesn't have a lot of information in it, but we look at thousands across the genome, and that gives us a really nice picture of actually really fine scale differences between populations. So I'm going to show you just some data from our initial work on the West Coast, looking from that red site as the southern extent of green crabs on the West Coast up to Vancouver Island. At the time that we did the sampling, that was pretty close to the northern extent of the range. It is not anymore. And I'm going to show you what the genetic data look like. So this is a principal components analysis. I promise there'll be a few more photos later too. It's a principal components analysis, and it's a way of summarizing these really complex genetic data, taking thousands of those different individual SNPs across the genome, and kind of looking at the biggest differences between individuals. So each of these dots is a crab, and the color tells you where the crab was collected. And the closer two dots are in two-dimensional space, the more closely related those crabs are. And so the big thing that I want you to notice is that there's a lot of overlap between most of these sites from the southern to the northern range edge, except for one site. That weird gray site kind of in the middle of the range is very distinctive. And that site is called Seadrift Lagoon. It's weird. It is an artificial lagoon created in the 70s by scooping out the middle of a protective sandbar. And the access to that lagoon is controlled by some pipes because it's all a private gated community. And according to the person that I emailed at the gated community, basically the pipes are not usually open very much in the winter, which is when green crab larvae are in the water column, because the tides can be kind of big and nobody wants to have their fancy private gated community waterfront property be in front of a mud flat. This is what I'm told. I would love that, but apparently this is not a major selling point. So essentially, it's a really weird and isolated lagoon. Larvae are probably not coming in from anywhere outside, and we don't think they're getting out either based on other genetic data that we've done. And what that tells us is essentially that if you cut off those movement of larvae, you get this really, you can really see it, right? It's very clear, even with these very recent populations, which makes us more confident that when we're thinking about all these other populations up and down the coast, the fact that they overlap really does indicate that larvae are going a long way up and down the coast, and that there's a huge amount of connection between most of these sites. Some other work that we've done has shown individual larvae likely going up to 400 kilometers from their starting place. So unfortunately, I work with a lot of managers on the West Coast. It's not a very helpful management. Well, it's helpful to know, but it would be a lot easier to manage if the connectivity were less high. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And that kind of exemplifies how well green crabs have spread. And we think it's probably very similar based on some other data on the East Coast as well, that there's a lot of connectivity and that larvae are moving around pretty extensively from place to place. So this dispersal seems to be really high. But we can see when dispersal is limited and these populations kind of break away and look very different. So kind of the last little thing I wanted to talk to you about is adaptation. So maybe if you were squinting your eyes a little bit, let's forget the weird sea drift population for now, look at the other sites. You might say, oh, maybe there's a little bit of a north-south gradient between those red sites in the south and the blue sites in the north. So we did some association testing, basically looking for genetic markers that are associated with temperature and latitude. And we found one. So the minor allele frequency is just how common is one version of this genetic variant in the population. So you can think about your like big A and your little a from Punnett squared. It's like what percentage of big A is in your population. And it shows a really nice latitudinal pattern from north to south. So this is some genetic variation that we think may be associated with thermal tolerance and with how green crabs deal with temperature. And it's not just one gene or one little region of the genome. It's actually dozens of genes that appear to be inherited together. It's something we often call a supergene. And these are things that we're increasingly finding in evolutionary genetics in systems where you have a lot of dispersal, where animals are moving back and forth quite a bit. These can be really powerful. It's a supergene that determines in Europe whether a codfish is migratory or whether it stays put, for example. If you're a bird person, if you look up the example of the ruff, it's an absolutely bizarre mating system with three different types of males that look super different, including one that looks like a female. They're described as being shaped like gravy boats. And this is also controlled by essentially a supergene. So these are kind of really interesting chunks of genetic variation that can be really important for rapid adaptation. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know why this isn't looking quite right here. But this is the plot that it looked fine on my computer before I was screen sharing. Um, this is the plot I showed you before of that genetic marker on the West Coast. And we also saw it in a previous study that includes some sites on the East Coast, so Maine and New Jersey. And we independently identified this genetic region as being really strongly associated, in this case, not just with latitude, but with cold tolerance. I actually did little EKGs on crabs and looked at the limits of their thermal tolerance, looking at their heart rates. And so this is something that we've been really interested in, is finding this genetic variation that seems really strongly associated with green crab thermal tolerance, how they deal with different temperatures. And we know that it evolved in the native range. This is something that came over from Europe, probably in that first introduction. And essentially, on the East Coast and the West Coast, it's something that selection can act on really, really quickly, potentially to help tune the populations genetically to their local temperature environment. So this is just a little cartoon that Natalie Rainier at WHOI made for me, showing kind of what we think happened is essentially green crabs made it over to the West Coast. We had some with this warmer version of this genetic variant, some with the more cold tolerant version, and then selection basically acts and you get this really nice gradient. We think that that may be really important to allowing green crab populations to respond really fast to their local temperature environments. Um, and essentially that green crabs may have sort of pre-evolved this genetic variation that allows them to really thrive under new and changing conditions. So they just really may be kind of winners as far as invasive species go in a lot of different areas, including evolutionarily. And the kind of main thing, I'm just about to wrap up, but the main thing that I wanted to emphasize, because I think it's important here on the East Coast as well as the West Coast, is this important link with temperature, and that we tend to see more green crabs in warmer, milder winters, which can have knock-on effects for ecosystems. But just as a little bit of a teaser for, I think, probably some work that in the future we'll hopefully be able to know more about. This might actually be changing because warm winters aren't just good for green crabs. They're good for blue crabs. So historically, blue crabs, their native range ends south of Cape Cod. but they've spread north into the Gulf of Maine, and they're getting more and more abundant. I don't know if anyone who traps has seen more blue crab, but even in the time I've been at WHOI, I've noticed more and more blue crab when I send out to trap. And blue crabs are mean, and they beat up green crabs and basically take their lunch money. I really like this photo that I found of a blue crab eating a green crab. And so there have been some sort of initial indications, nothing quantifiable yet, but just in talking with folks who are looking at crabs in the area, that in warmer years, we may be getting more blue crabs, and that may result in maybe fewer green crabs. So that's very speculative, but it's, I mention it just to say that the world is changing really fast and it's changing in a lot of different ways. So even the things that we might have thought based on the past, maybe shifting into the future. And with that, since we are ending on a green crab getting eaten, I want to point out as well, if anyone is interested, that we can also eat green crabs, although I think we're not quite as mean as the blue crabs are. I know there are some restaurants that serve them. There's a lot of kind of Eat the Invasives. There's a green crab cookbook. They taste good, but they're a lot of work to pick the meat out of, is my take on it. And I was also think I may stop screen sharing. Can take questions, but let's see. I was going to say there's
Oh,
also a whiskey with green crabs in it.
oh my goodness.
However, I don't know if everyone can see.
Greta.
We talked about what a green crab is. There are not five spines on this crab. So, although I am told the whiskey is really made with green crabs, and I believe it because it does have a distinct low tide aftertaste, the label is actually not a green crab, very unfortunately.
I think there's a website, the greencrab.org. And it says, I think at the top of the website, it says something like problem to plate. And they,
Yep.
and there's a listing of a number of restaurants that do serve the green crab. So yeah, I found that interesting. That's a cool cookbook. Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
Well,
so I
thank
mean,
you.
if you're getting green crab and you want to eat them, I boiled them up and served them at a dinner party once. We had other food that was important.
Oh my God.
But they taste good, but they're a lot of work. So if you've ever eaten blue crab and you know that that's a little more of like a cultural experience really
Mhm.
than like a fast and satisfying meal, green crab are significantly more work to output ratio than blue crab. So uh,
We do have some questions here.
mm.
So let's get right into a couple of them really interesting here. Jared wanted to know the approximate lifespan of a green crab.
About 6 years.
Really?
Mhm. So it depends a little on where you are. They start to reproduce in their first or second after their first or second year. Again, it depends a lot on temperature. So around us, I think it's closer to 2 years in warmer areas, about one before they can be reproductive. But yeah, you can up to 6 years, we think.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Mike asks that he would love to know how he could play a part in getting rid of them. He'd be willing to spend some time removing them.
Well,
And
the
Kate also asks, what are effective ways of reducing their population? So kind of a twofer there.
Mhm. That is something that people are putting a lot of time and effort in. So the best approach so far seems to just be trapping. There's a lot of work into trying to figure out, can we make it more effective? Can we target the females with eggs, for example? Right now, they don't tend to go into baited traps as much, so we get fewer of them. I'm also been talking with some folks. There's some interest in maybe doing like genome informed management. So we're developing a crab genome with the hopes that that may give us some indications of, are there any maybe pesticides that might be effective on green crabs, or are there other kind of interventions that might be helpful? Um, but really, unfortunately, the kind of good old-fashioned trapping seems to be the most effective thing, but there are so many green crabs out there. Um, As a little note on trapping, though, the reason that we did the study that I talked about on the West Coast is my collaborators had done a long-term trapping study. So basically, exactly that. Like, what is an effective way of trapping green crabs down? How long does that last, right? Like, how much effort do you have to put in? And they trapped in a bunch of different bays around California for a number of years, including that several of the places that we sampled for genetics, including that weirdo one, Seadrift Lagoon. And they found that by doing a pretty intensive trapping scheme year after year, the populations would go down a little bit in some places. They went down a lot in Seadrift Lagoon, and then all of a sudden there were 3 times as many crabs as there had ever been there before. They were all really young. And we think because it's so isolated, we think basically all the crabs that are in Seadrift Lagoon were born in Seadrift Lagoon. It's something called the Hydra effect. So big green crabs eat little green crabs. And so by trapping all the big green crabs out, even though there weren't a lot of reproductive crabs, they were still making a lot of little crabs, and now there weren't as many big crabs to eat them. We didn't see that happen anywhere else where the populations were more open and the larvae were moving around more. But that was a little bit of a cautionary tale that if you have a really isolated population, it may seem like a really effective way to trap it out, but you want to not just trap the big crabs.
So Mike also says as a comment with regard to your whiskey, a whiskey aficionado had told him that it's not the best whiskey out there.
You know, I think it's probably the best whiskey made with crabs.
Let me tell you, so we're now a little bit flooded with questions, the most I've seen since we've been doing this for 5 years. So let's just do a kind of a rapid fire because I don't want to take up
Okay. Yep.
everybody's
Sorry.
evening.
Yeah.
No, that's
I'll
good.
try
That's
to
great.
be
No, I
briefer.
mean, I love the questions and so many of them are fascinating here. Jared says, is there a reason why you're not seeing any green crabs inside Vancouver Island when they appear to have spread north and south, but not there specifically?
Okay, I'm going to try to answer this briefly because I actually do a huge amount of work up there. They have recently spread into the Salish Sea, so they are starting to get in there. They're now in the Puget Sound area and over in eastern Washington. And we've actually done a lot of work, and we think basically temperature is why they've recently expanded in there, even though for a really long time they were just on the outer part of the coast. Essentially, there's a this interaction of the currents mostly go out of the Strait of Juan de Fuca when the green crabs are in the water column. So there's not a good avenue in from the coast. Um, and sometimes that reverses. Sometimes you get some water going in, but usually in the winter when it's too cold for the green crabs to survive. But it's been warmer recently. And so we think basically that that nice barrier that was protecting the Salish Sea is kind of gone now. So we're watching green crabs now expand in those inland waters. Unfortunately, but that's another thing where we're pretty sure temperature played a really important role in kind of opening up that environment.
Tom asks if you could tell us about the commercial harvesting of green and blue crabs.
Ooh, well, I know there's a huge amount of commercial harvesting of blue crab, right? That's a major, I think it's the major fishery. Well, I'm not sure where it stands in relation to oysters, but it's a major fishery, particularly in Maryland. Green crab harvesting is pretty boutique still. And that's because I think there's a good money for blue crab and there isn't really for green crab. So people are trying to figure out how to use green crab maybe as bait alternatives for certain things. People make crab juice out of it. You put it on, you can put it on your garden and fertilize. We get with our West Coast work, people send us frozen green crabs, but we only need little tissue samples. So we take like a gill out, and then we have all of these little crab carcasses in the freezer. And we actually gave them to Farming Falmouth. So um, so they will be fueling some of their growth. And there are other people trying to figure out how to get soft shell green crab. It's kind of hard to predict when green crabs are going to molt. So far, that hasn't been hugely successful, but that's one thing people have been thinking about, or other ways to kind of process and use the meat. But so far, I don't think there's like a major commercial fishery for them, just because they're just I don't there's not enough money in them to make that feasible, unfortunately. At least not currently. Maybe that will change.
Well, Sarah says thank you for the excellent information. Doug says, when I was a kid, blue crabs were prolific in the south-facing ponds and bays. Now there are hardly any. I like the idea that blue crab can dominate the green crab. How do we help the blue crab proliferate?
Well, I think, I mean, my understanding is recently they're doing pretty well on their own with this temperature increase. Their blue crab are now breeding in southern Maine. Um, that's a pretty recent thing. Um, but it's kind of interesting in terms of the blue and green crab dynamic. Um, on the East Coast, green crabs kind of stop before the Chesapeake Bay. But there shouldn't be any reason for them not to be in the Chesapeake in the sense of it's not too hot or too fresh or anything like that. But there was some work done by a colleague of mine, Kat Rivera, a number of years ago, and basically showed that the blue crabs are just they outcompete the green crab. And so we think that maybe the fact that the Chesapeake has this huge blue crab population has been essentially like stopping the green crab from getting established and making it further south. Um, and like I said, it's still really new, but it's just observational that there's a blue crab network in New England, and folks have been mentioning, oh, we're seeing more blues and fewer greens. And it's still really early to kind of know exactly what those patterns look like, but yeah, there may be some potential there, which it's kind of a nice idea that that one of our native species might be able to help with our invasive problem.
Linda chimed in and she asked, what are the natural predators in Europe, and are any new predators developing in U.S. waters other than the blue crab?
I think just generally fish and birds will pick at and eat green crab. And the same thing on the East Coast. I'm not as familiar with that literature, but after 200 years, plenty of stuff will go after green crabs if they can. So that's something that we sometimes do look at if we're trapping green crab is we look at damage, right? Like how many have missing limbs and things like that. And that can give us some idea of like how much they're getting munched on. So there are things that eat them around here. But I think it's more just anything that will eat a crab that size will go after a green crab. Um, the blue crab seem to be kind of unusually good at kind of competing with them and kind of eating them. But blue crabs are very mean.
Paul has a comment and a question. He says he's noticed many green crabs in the marshes in the Bass Hole, Grays Beach region in the Yarmouthport area. He said they burrow in the mud.
Mhm.
What damage have they been doing to our marshlands?
They do damage the marshlands when they burrow, right? Because they're kind of undercutting the roots, and then it makes it easier for some of that kind of peaty material to subside. So when you see them in areas like that, they are doing damage not just to the eelgrass, but to some of the marsh areas as well. Uh,
Elizabeth asked, are green crabs smaller than the blue crab?
They are, yeah. So the green crabs, well, like a lot of invertebrates, they follow something called Bergmann's rule, which is kind of interesting. Basically, like the colder it is, the bigger you tend to get. So like when I was up in Newfoundland, where I ate the green crabs, they were the biggest green crabs that I've seen. They were about this big across the back, right? So they had some decently meaty claws. They're much smaller near us, but kind of I'd say a full-grown green crab about this big across the back, and right, the blue crab can get much larger. So they're not a huge crab, but they're really good. They tend to be really abundant, which is part of what kind of gives them their power. They're also really not picky eaters.
dug scallops, and he often finds green crab in the scallops
Mhm.
that he harvests. He asks, should I kill all the green crabs that I find?
If you want to, go right ahead. It's not likely to make a huge difference just because there are so many green crab, but it can't hurt. Uh, as as a note, it's kind of interesting, right? I have to get collection permits when I do field work, and most places are really concerned, like how many animals will you take, and you're going to minimize, and you're going to put all your bycatch back. Um, my permit up in Maine for green crab, it has an explicit thing that says I can take as many green crab as I want, but I can't put them back alive. So if I trap it, I kill it or I take it and I leave it out of the water, which is not typical in a collecting permit.
Aziz says, what adaptations do the green crab have to survive the warmer winters? And how do these differ from those of other residential species of crabs?
That's a really interesting question. That's something my lab is really, really interested in. We do a lot of physiological work too. One thing with green crabs is they are really flexible in terms of their thermal physiology. So there are differences between populations. Warmer populations can deal with warmer temperatures better, but pretty much all green crabs are kind of amazing. They can handle quite high temperatures and quite low temperatures, which gives them kind of a bit of a leg up over a lot of our native species, many of which are pretty flexible, but not necessarily that flexible. Um, when it's really cold, well, like a lot of crabs, but green crabs will just kind of hunker down and kind of go into torpor. So they can survive even up in Newfoundland where the waters are getting to be below zero. They're not doing much, but they're surviving. Uh, and that's also why we're so interested in this genetic variation, because we think that essentially it gives them sort of flexibility. So it kind of maintains in this population as a whole some variation that helps you deal with the cold and some that helps you deal with the heat. And essentially wherever you land as a larva, because you could go hundreds of miles away from where you were born, selection will then let you survive or not survive based on your genetics in part. And we think that that's part of what lets them spread really effectively is it's not this long, gradual generation to generation process of adapting. They've sort of already got what they need.
Regina, she's a teacher. She wants her seventh grade students, they want to do something. What do you suggest that she tells them?
Oh, like they want to do something about green crabs.
I think maybe something proactive to help. Yeah, I would think yes.
I mean, you can always put traps down. You can just keep an eye out for them. You can let people know that they're an invasive species. I think a lot of people around here probably know, but maybe not everybody. I don't know that this is something that I haven't seen this done on Cape Cod. I'd be very curious though, but I'm sure it is. They're sold live for bait. And so not dumping live green crabs that you've bought for bait somewhere else is a really nice thing that people can do. Um, but yeah, I would say like on a student level, you can trap them. You can, depending on where you are, you can just flip over rocks and you can find them and you can pull them if you want to try to do something and take them out. You can do that. And the best way to kind of kill them humanely is to put them in the freezer. Um,
Someone commented, an anonymous person said a low-tech way to trap them is to sink tennis ball cans in the sand and the crabs
ah,
fall in. And
yeah. And that's good for getting the little ones
yeah,
too. Yeah.
yeah, in Nantucket, the green crabs were causing erosion, he says. So
Yeah, no, that's something down here in kind of south of Cape Cod that's been one of the many issues with them.
is anyone at WHOI, is anyone a little off topic, but is anyone researching the Japanese shore crabs who have, I guess, newly arrived in New England?
I've done a little bit of work with them, and I know someone who recently retired from UMass Dartmouth, Nancy O'Connor, did quite a bit of work, and her student Renee Montanaro did a huge amount with those. Yeah, those are really interesting too, because they're a much newer invader. They're about I think they got to us around the 80s or so, 80s or 90s. And they're sort of pushing out the green crabs from the upper Rocky intertidal, right? So like when I was a kid, you'd flip over a rock and well, if I were to come down to Cape Cod, I'd flip over a rock and there'd probably be a lot of green crabs. Now you flip over a rock and it's just like all these little tiny Asian shore crabs. They're the square ones with the stripy legs. They just kind of boil out from under the rock. Um, and so they seem to be, I don't want to say they're replacing green crabs. I think they're just forcing green crabs to other places. And we don't have a great handle on what they're doing in terms of impacts, but they have gotten to be hyper abundant.
Hmm.
And they're also moving north, so they're now in the southern Gulf of Maine as well. There's kind of a really interesting crab gradient. So like down here, you flip over rocks, it's going to be almost all the Asian shore crabs. You move up into the southern Gulf of Maine, and you flip over rocks. Like I grew up in New Hampshire, so like Odeon State Park, you flip over rocks, and you're going to be about like 50-50 green crabs and the Asian shore crab. And then if you move up a little further in Maine, you're hard pressed to find the Asian shore crabs, but they're also moving north, is unfortunately. They're now persistent in parts of southern Nova Scotia, which is way farther north than we thought they were going to get based on where they live in the native range.
And Catherine has a comment and a question. She says, you've been delightful, enthusiastic in your science, and super informative. Thank you so much. And her question is, where on the Cape specifically, where can we expect to find them in abundance? Are there specific places that you've seen more so than others?
So I have found that I see them more around, is particularly southern Cape Cod when I trap. So sometimes you'll see them under rocks and stuff, but like in places with sort of sandier bottoms, putting down baited traps tends to be where I get the most green crabs. Um, and that's kind of really almost anywhere, I think, especially places that are maybe a little bit more protected, like in some of the salt ponds. If we need them for experiments and we don't need them from a specific place, we'll just put traps down in Eel Pond, which is right next to my lab. Um, and so, kind of, especially a little bit more protected areas that are still pretty salty, are probably about the best places to get them. But as I said, if you want to see little green crabs, kind of go around the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, and if you kind of time it right, you'll see any kind of sandy beach or pebbly beach. I think there are probably other places too. It's just easier to see them on the sand. They're about they're smaller than my pinky fingernail, but they're everywhere, running all around. Um, yeah.
Ashley says, I stroll the this is just a comment, but I stroll the marsh edge. I rip them apart to feed the minnows, and the minnows wait for me the very next day. My family thinks I am nuts. I have seen spider crabs, sand crab populations tank, but Ashley says, thanks for all of your hard work, Carolyn. All very interesting. Carol asks a couple questions specifically about the blue crab. Do they destroy seagrass and do they eat shellfish?
So I'm not a blue crab
Mhm.
expert. I don't know about seagrass and blue
Okay, of
crab, so I don't want to get out over my skis on that.
course.
Um, I don't I don't think so, not to the same extent, but I'm not sure. And then clams, I think they also will go after small shellfish, is my understanding. I think some of the experiments that have been done are like competition experiments. If you have a green crab and a blue crab and some clams, like who gets the clams, if I'm recalling correctly. But I am not sure the extent to which that's an issue versus green crabs. A lot of the blue crabs are, right, they're really common down in the Chesapeake where people are a lot more concerned about oysters. And that doesn't seem to be a major issue for those. But the oysters are also harder to get at because they kind of accrete to things.
Just do a couple more here. Mike asks about the East Coast trapping time. Is there a best time for that?
In terms of trapping, I'm not sure if there's a best time, but not in the winter. Basically, they get cold and sluggish, and they're gonna be there's a couple things going on. One is they just don't move around as much because they're cold-blooded, so the temperature outside is the temperature that the crab is. And so metabolism is really temperature linked. So their metabolisms just go way down when it's cold. So everything slows down. They're not moving around as much, but they also don't need as much food. So they're going to be less attracted to a trap. So in the winter, we don't usually tend to try to trap much. You might get a crab or two, but you're not going to get much. I'd say when it warms up, you're much more likely to get them.
Is there a way that we can get more restaurants to offer the green crab specialties or on their menu? John asks.
I mean, I don't know. I think you could always ask. You could talk to
Oh,
the folks at greencrab.org. That's one of the things that they're really interested in doing is kind of getting, I mean, they published the Green Crab Cookbook, is getting them on menus. There is a commercial use that I didn't mention that I think is kind of neat. I haven't had a chance to try this, but there's apparently a company called Saint Hours that makes commercial like seafood stock concentrates. So they do I think like they do a clam one and they do maybe a lobster one, I can't remember, and they now do a crab one that they use green crabs for. And so that's not something that like we can buy at the supermarket, at least not right now. But apparently it's being sold for like from a restaurant supply perspective, which I think is really cool. That's one of the only real, it's one of the only things that I've heard of that seems like a kind of an economically viable use for green crabs, kind of at a little bit of a larger scale. So I thought that was quite cool. And they
very.
use green crabs. There's a sister species that looks really similar in the Mediterranean, and it's a traditional ingredient in bouillabaisse there.
Oh.
Uh,
Last one. Marcia asks, what are the natural controls in Europe?
well, okay. Oh, you're touching on one of my other favorite things. Um, so one of the interesting differences between Europe is here and here are that green crabs have a lot more parasites in Europe. That's actually something that's not uncommon with invasive species, and that's one of the theories as to why some invasive populations can do really well is because when you move, you tend to not bring your parasites or not bring many of your parasites with you. So maybe you have a little bit of a leg up over the native species, which are kind of like they're getting dragged down by all their little hangers on, right? Um, and so we know a decent amount about parasites in green crabs. A colleague of mine, April Blakesley, has done a lot of work kind of showing that there are a lot of parasites in Europe. There are a lot fewer parasites of green crabs on the East Coast, and we haven't found any on the West Coast. So, like that kind of sequential thing. And so, one of the parasites in Europe is a castrating parasitic barnacle. It's amazing. It's called Saculina carcini. And what it castrates the crabs. It basically co-opts the crab's own reproduction. It doesn't look anything like a barnacle. It actually grows little tendrils all throughout the inside of the crab. It's extremely cool. And so, at least in parts of Europe, that is probably a natural population control to some extent. Um, People always love to talk about Saccharina as a potential biological control, but the problem is you want to be really careful about introducing a species to control another species because it kind of becomes like the little old lady who swallowed a fly, right? And there can be unintended consequences. But back when green crabs first made it to the West Coast, there were some experiments done looking at infection. So, like, how easy is it for basically like this parasite? Can you infect West Coast green crabs with it? You can. Can you infect other West Coast crabs with it, native crabs? And the answer is not effectively, but it will try to infect them and it'll kill them. And so the decision was this is too dangerous a thing to potentially introduce. So unfortunately, there are some stuff, things like that that are like they sound really appealing, but it's it's so hard to be sure that an animal is going to behave in the way you expect it to and not change in a new environment, that some of those potential biocontrol measures are not really being considered because we're just, you know, what would be the consequences if, you know, this thing tries to infect lobsters and starts killing them, or blue crabs and starts killing them, or other native species. So,
Wow.
but yeah, the parasite angle I think is really cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Carolyn, with the presentation and taking the time to answer all these questions. Truly appreciate it. I hope everyone has a better understanding of the green crab. And for everyone out there watching, please stay in touch. If you have any questions for Carolyn, I'm happy to email them to her. My address is peter@saveoursound.org, or you can reach out to our president, Audra Parker. She's at audra@saveoursound.org. And we have a couple of webinars coming up that I hope you register for. Let's see right here. Boom. March and April. We've had two speakers from the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. They were marvelous webinars. We have a third one with Dr. Sarah Boyce on wildflowers and wildlife, sand, plain, grasslands, and heathlands. She's going to guide us through why these grasslands and heathlands are so special, how the maritime climate, including wind and salt spray, shape these habitats. You can sign up for these webinars, watch any of our old ones at saveoursound.org/ACONS. The one in April and spring, we have conservation leader Mark Robinson from the Compact. He's going to do a history and a future of land conservation on Cape Cod and the islands. So hope you register for those, excited for those. Thank you, Carolyn. This weekend, everybody, stay inside, stay warm, stay safe. And again, Carolyn, thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for taking your time to listen to me
I
blabber
loved it.
about green crabs. It's always a pleasure.
Have a great
And
night,
actually,
everybody.
Peter, if you can send me your set list for the
Oh,
pre-start music, I would love it.
we need to reach out to musicians. You're absolutely right. There are very few songs about crabs, and it is a grave
A
omission.
terrible oversight.
Have a great one. Thanks, Carolyn. I
Take
will
care.
send
Bye.
you.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
night.